Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland. Here I am at number 22, Cleveland Street, London. And in the house behind me, Charles Dickens resided twice just after the Napoleonic Wars. So who was Charles Dickens? Well, how the Dickens should I know? You see how he's become a household name. Anyway, he's perhaps the most famous novelist of the 19th century in the English language, wildly popular both in this country and across the Atlantic. So Dickens was born in Portsmouth, which is a town on the southern coast of England, and his father was an administrator in the Royal Navy, not an officer. He was doing the bureaucratic work, and he had a high and affluently paid job. However, his father also had a drinking problem, and Charles Dickens' father was demoted because of his dipsomania. He later lost his job, so they moved from a large house to a smaller house, from that one to an even smaller house, and really they were downwardly mobile. It got worse and worse for the Dickens family, so they soon moved to London. So Charles Dickens was obliged to leave school at the age of 12 and take on full-time work because he was one of about a dozen children, and he worked in a boot polish factory which is on the side of what's now Charing Cross Station. And he found his work tedious in the extreme, soul-destroying really, and so his mind would take flight into fantasy, and he would make up these rollicking good tales in order to pass the time and attempt to keep his wits together. So that's how he maintained his sanity, and he later became a journalist, and that was his creative outlet. So he wrote many stories there and began contributing to magazines. It's hard to remember now how much more important the written word was in the 19th century, before television, before even radio. And it was becoming a case of mass literacy. By the end of the 19th century, well, 1870, there was compulsory schooling in this country, but even prior to that, the majority of people could read. And those who had reading as a hobby would read voraciously, because that was the only entertainment, unless you're going to go to a concert, go to the theatre, something like that. People would read these novels which would seem turgid to us. They were very demanding, one had to concentrate fully. Remember, people had a much longer concentration span in those days. A book had to be challenging, it had to last, and they were pricey, because printing was expensive, you know, it all had to be laid out by hand, none of this computerized printing. So Dickens's novels reflect that. They are heavy weather by today's standards. They're not these trashy airport departure lounge novels that you read on the beach. And you might notice how episodic much of his work is, in that he often leaves it on a cliffhanger, because they're usually published in newspapers in the Saturday edition, and he had to leave you hungry, so that you wanted to buy it next week to find out what happened. So he wrote so many of them: Martin Chuzzlewit, Oliver Twist, and you'll notice his sympathy with the underdog. And he was an avid campaigner for social justice. He noticed how the proletariat suffered abysmally. He himself had suffered that way. His father, John Dickens, had gone into prison for debt. In those days, it was on the south bank of the Thames, near Elephant and Castle. I can't remember the name of it actually, but since been demolished. And he was able to visit his father in prison. Little Dorrit is a bit of a reflection of this. So someone went to debt until such time as the debt was paid off. And if your family and friends weren't going to bail you out, that was it. You could be there to the day you croaked. Now, it was possible for a man to earn a living in prison because, well, until the 1820s, prison was very different. If you were wealthy, prison wasn't too bad. A man could have his wife and children with him. They could go in and out as much as they want, as many visitors as you want, eat, drink as you like, wear what you like, no uniform, have a room and a drawing room and all the rest of it. But if you were penniless, the life there was abysmal, and you'd often die of a disease. 20 prisoners to a small cell. And as men are criminals much more so than the women, there'd often be a woman in there with 20 men, and I think you can guess what they would do to her, the sort of crime that only men can commit against a woman, because men and women were not separated in prison until the 1820s. And the prison officers made their money from extracting bribes from the prisoners, torturing them, doing whatever they needed to get money out of them, chaining them to a corpse, things like that, to try and induce them to get their relatives to pay a tip to the jailer. But anyway, so Oliver Twist is one of his novels about a child from a well-got family who ends up in a workhouse and all the rest of it. And then he finds his real family adore him and are rich. The old story, every orphan's dream. And there's so many more of them: the Pickwick Papers, Bleak House, Barnaby Rudge, Hard Times, about that McChokum child, that sadistic pedagogue. I could go on and on. So that's Charles Dickens. He sailed to the United States, and he gave readings from his work there. And Oliver Twist, of course, was not a play. It was only the 20th century that's turned into a play, and they did a musical. So it's better known to most people in that medium. But he made a lot of money from that, and then the tax authorities in the United States started chasing him to pay tax on his very handsome earnings, because the United States didn't recognize a foreign copyright right at the time. So the only way to make money was through reading from there. He couldn't get it from royalties. So he was lionized by a Victorian society for here, and he drew attention, the attention of parlour society to the lot of the great unwashed. And because of his zealous sympathy for the impecunious, then legislation was passed to better the lot of the average person. So he wasn't explicitly political, never stood for Parliament, wasn't very involved in that way. So he's married, had several children. He also had a long-term mistress, which was not to the liking of his wife. So he lived in several different locations in London. This is one of the few that exists. You can go to Doughty Street, go into his house. This tailor's shop behind me is not open to the public. And he was very wealthy. He had a country house as well, just to the south of London. Well, and so his son went to Eton, no less. So Charles Dickens, he died quite suddenly in 1862. So Dickens, well worth reading up on.